The one who is kind to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will reward them for what they have done. That's Proverbs 19:17. That's the proverb that stood out to me, grabbed my attention this week. I think that's a pretty cool idea. It's kind of like when Jesus comes along and he says, whatever you've done for the least of these, you've done for me. So he says, when you helped those in prison, you helped me. When you fed people, you fed me. When you clothed people, you clothed me. I think Jesus is probably picking up on this proverb when he says all that stuff. Question 2, what is the big idea across the Proverbs that you've considered? Oh, by the way, let me orientate you. This week we're looking at Proverbs relating to justice. And I think the big idea that comes with these Proverbs is maybe a little bit of a controversial one. I think that these Proverbs are basically saying that you reap what you sow. What you give to others is what you'll get in return. And the reason I think that that's controversial is because it's like tit for tat. It's kind of like maybe other religions have called it sort of karma, or some people say like it's kind of like the universe paying you back. But I think that when we read those sorts of ideas in Proverbs, it's actually quite different because Proverbs, like we said at the start, they're not promises. It doesn't always work this way, but it probably will work this way. So they're not promises, they're probability. Usually when you do the wrong thing will happen to you. Usually when you do the right thing will happen to you. And Ecclesiastes and Job are there to remind us that that is not always the case, remember? Because the guy in Job was perfectly good all of the time and yet found himself in a desperately bad situation. Proverbs isn't karma. These things aren't about karma. It's not the universe getting its payback or whatever. These are patterns that God has woven into the fabric of the universe. Patterns that God has woven into the fabric of the universe. Question 3. What questions, if any, are in your mind about the meaning or message of these Proverbs? No questions really so much this week, but I think it's just really great to remember that God cares about the refugee, he cares about the poor, he cares about the oppressed, he cares about the widow, the orphan, and all of these Proverbs demonstrate that. Proverbs 22:22 says, "Do not exploit the poor because they are poor, and do not crush the needy in court, for the Lord will take up their case and plunder those who plunder them." So it's good to remember that God cares about the outcast, the downcast. When you get to James in the New Testament, which is what we're doing at youth this term, and it's New Testament wisdom. Basically, James probably read Proverbs and then just reminded the churches that he was writing to of some of the things that Proverbs says. But this is what he says. "If anyone considers himself religious and does not keep a tight rein on his tongue, he deceives himself and his religion is worthless." And this is where he talks about taking care of the orphans and the widows. "Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world." And after he says that, he goes on to talk about favoritism toward rich people simply because they're rich. That's very similar to the Proverbs that we've read here. Fourth question, have you ever lived out the wisdom of the Proverbs you considered? Have you seen others do so? Tell the story. The one proverb that I kind of thought about interestingly is Proverbs 24, 23 and 25. This is what it says: "To show partiality in judging is not wise. Whoever says to the guilty, you are innocent." Whoever says to the guilty, you are innocent. People will curse him and nations will denounce him. What I find really interesting about that one is that you might kind of think that that's a description of the gospel. Jesus, or God, declares us who are guilty sinners to be innocent. And this is why the work of Jesus is so important, because if God were to just say, "Hey, you down there, you're innocent," that would be, as this proverb says, that would be bad. That would not be good justice. And so rather than just declaring guilty people innocent, God takes our guilt and he transfers it onto his son, and his son pays the penalty for our guilt. And so God remains a good and just judge, and we get off even though we're guilty. So it's cool to see that the gospel plays out even against the wisdom of Proverbs. Yeah, that was something that I took away from this week. Enjoy the readings. Next week we have authority. Ooh.